Hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm your host, Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are pleased to have veteran newspaper reporter and author Don Hatfield with us today to talk about his latest book and also his career as a reporter and a journalist. And Don Hatfield joins us as a former publisher and editor of the Huntington, West Virginia Herald-Dispatch and the Tucson Arizona Citizen, as well as a regional vice president of Gannett Newspapers. Don is a native of Huntington, and he began a 47-year newspaper career on the Huntington Advertiser as an 18-year-old sports writer. He eventually became that newspaper's managing editor and became executive editor of the Herald-Dispatch when the two newspapers merged. He later became president, publisher, and editor of the Herald-Dispatch and a regional vice president of Gannett Newspapers in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. In 1986, he was promoted to president, publisher, and editor of the Tucson Citizen and a regional vice president over Gannett Newspapers in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. He was named to the Arizona Newspapers Hall of Fame in 2001, and he's the author of many magazine articles and 3 books. Don Hatfield Cleans Out His Attic, a collection of his newspaper columns, A Pocket Full of Cinders, a collection of short stories, and A Newspaperman, a Memoir, a personal account of his life in newspapers. And that's certainly the one we're going to talk about today, Newspaperman, a Memoir, which is his personal account. We'll talk much more about that shortly. But after 22 years of working and living in Tucson, Arizona, he returned to Huntington in 2008, where he now lives. And it's my pleasure to welcome Don Hatfield with us today. Don, good to see you. Welcome to Chapters.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You have such a wonderful, interesting career as a reporter and a newspaper man. I want to start kind of, I guess, at the beginning. You started out as a part-time sports reporter when you were 18 years old, and in that role you were working for the Huntington Advertiser, and you wanted to be a sports reporter. That was something you always wanted to do, right. But then things kind of changed for you. Tell us a little bit about how it all started for you.
Well, I walked in a couple of days short of my 18th birthday looking for a job as a copy boy. They'd already hired a copy boy. I was planning to go to Marshall in the fall and study journalism. I thought that would be a good experience. But they had just named a new sports editor on the Advertiser, Ernie Salvatore. And so I met with him, and Ernie hired me as a part-time sports writer. After 1 week, the managing editor of the paper asked me if I'd like to spend the rest of the week as a City Cub reporter, so I did that. But in the fall, I became full-time sports, and I stayed in sports, moving up from sports writer to assistant sports editor for 7 years. And by that time, I had had my fill of sports and parents and coaches and players, and you can never make any of them happy. And I moved to the news side as an assistant news editor, and I was in editor's roles the rest of my career.
And what was that like, sort of making that shift from sports, where, as you said, you were dealing with coaches and parents and games and sports scores and all of that, to working more on the hard news? Was that a tough shift to make when you started out, or was it a lot of the same skills, just kind of in a different format?
Well, it wasn't the same skills because I was no longer reporting or writing other than headlines, because I was an editor of first Associated Press and United Press copy, and then I would draw up pages, write headlines, and edit other people's work. And that's what I did from then on, but moving up the ladder. So as I said, I was a little tired of sports, and I wanted also to be a novelist and short story writer. And in sports, I never had much time left. But if I moved to the desk, it was a regular job, and I could go home in the middle of the afternoon and write. So that's what I did for a while. So no, it wasn't difficult to leave sports.
Very good. I wanted to ask you about a moment in your career where you worked as the managing editor of the Sunday Herald Advertiser, and during your time there, you saw, I would imagine, a lot of disasters that took place in the state. The Marshall plane crash, the Silver Creek Bridge collapse. I even did some research during that period. The Buffalo Creek flood certainly was during your tenure there. There was even a Monongalia Power Company construction accident that killed 53 workers. So it seems like there was a lot going on there.
Well, this is West Virginia, and we've had plenty of disasters. And I detail those in this book, and how we made decisions, how we covered them, how we assigned reporters, how the reporters did with them. I was especially involved, though, in the Marshall plane crash because I was putting out the Sunday paper, and on Saturday night I was finished the paper early and was getting ready to go out to dinner, and I heard on the police radio. It's funny, in those days you could train yourself to hear only the important things. And I heard something about a plane down at Tri-State Airport. And I looked at my watch and I thought, oh no, don't tell me it's the Marshall plane. Well, it turned out to be that. And I had just had lunch 2 days before with two of my friends, one of them a fraternity brother, who were going to that game, and I knew they were on that plane with their wives, and my heart just sank. And I got sick, but I knew I had to get the paper out. So we had a kind of task force in those days of reporters and editors and photographers so that we knew where they were in case we had to call them out. Well, we put that into effect, and we sent people to hospitals, to obviously the airport, to the scene, worked the rest of the night, put out a first edition, then went up 4 pages and put out a final edition, and it was quite a night. I had to put behind me the fact that there were many of my friends on there, and put behind me the fact that Marshall's football team was all but wiped out. And we got the paper out, but by the time I got home, 3 o'clock in the morning, I sat down in the darkened living room and just started shaking. It was a terrible thing.
You mentioned assigning reporters and covering that. What are some of the challenges for people who, we get our news in so many different ways now, but we see, tragedies and accidents and disasters constantly happening in our country, in our state, and throughout the world. What goes on behind the scenes? We turn on the TV and there's the coverage, or we pick up the newspaper and there it is. What are some of the things that go on behind the scenes? You mentioned, assigning reporters and making, but covering that. What are the kind of decisions that reporters have to make when they're out on the field, and you in a supervisory role have to make when a disaster happens, and some of the steps that have to be taken, and how does that all work? Because I think we take for granted we just see it and read it, but there's
before we formed our task force, we had been caught short, not prepared for certain disasters. But by the night of the plane crash, we were pretty well prepared. So we knew that this reporter is going to this hospital, and this reporter is going to the scene, and this photographer is going there, and so forth. Even before the event occurred, that was already planned. It wasn't always that way, so we learned some valuable lessons. There were several stories, some of them even a little funny, about coverage and how we went about doing it, how we would try to get a ride on a military vehicle into the scene of the tragedy. There were many, as you know, as we just said. And I remember I had a hardened reporter from Northwestern. She was a terrific reporter, probably just about one of the two best at that time on our paper. And when the scaffolding collapsed, you mentioned that, I sent her. And she got there and she called me and said, Hatfield, which she always called me, I can't do this. I was stunned. She said, it's too much. It's too much. I can't do it. All these people are dead. All their families are here. They're all torn up. I can't bear it. I can't interview them. And I was surprised because she was so tough and usually unmoved by things. And I said, well, we've got Associated Press writers there, Kevin. We've got another writer on the way. Do what you can do. Talk to some of the officials if you can't talk to the families. Do what you can. Mm-hmm. And she did a better job than she expected to do, and we were able to put together pretty good coverage. We sent a fleet of people to Buffalo Creek when that earthen dam collapsed. There were various other things, floods in southern West Virginia, and we were able to charter a small plane and put a photographer and a reporter on that. I also learned from my female reporters. I sort of was unaware of how things had changed. There was a time when you sent men only on tough assignments where they might get hurt. You didn't send women. So there was this one big flood in southern West Virginia, and I assigned 2 or 3 male writers and a couple of male photographers to do that. And in minutes, I had 2 of my best reporters, who were female, in my office, angry, wanting to know why they didn't get to go on this assignment. And I started to say, well, you know, I didn't want to say, well, you're women, I don't want you to get hurt. And I thought about it, and I said, what am I thinking? I said, you'll both go. Well, one of them managed to get on a plane, and the other one hit the back roads in her car. The one on the plane was the first reporter in to the area. Plane landed. She saw a farmer in a john boat, convinced him to take her in the john boat into the flooded area. Nobody else had done that. So she was the first. She won an award for that. But that was a real teaching moment for me, because after that, I never thought male-female when assigning a story, whether that was a tragedy or sports or whatever.
Interesting. That's really interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm very glad you mentioned that, because that's very interesting, especially in these days and times where we have almost as many, female journalists and reporters as we do males.
But we're talking many, many years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you, one of the interesting things about your book, most of your book takes place in West Virginia. In fact, it's not until we get to around chapter 37 that you kind of take us away from, or outside of West Virginia, to your experiences in Tucson, Arizona.
Actually, it's page 362.
362, very good. What was that like, leaving here and going to Tucson, Arizona, and what was that like as kind of your responsibilities changed? And you mentioned sort of climbing up the ladder. Now you found yourself in different roles, and you mentioned, we were talking a little bit before we started taping, that you were in charge of USA Today's distridition warehouse there in Arizona. What was that like for you, sort of making that change, leaving here and going there?
The biggest change was cultural. It's 2 different worlds. Tucson, many years ago, was kind of a big cowboy town, a big ranch town. Well, it's not that anymore. Phoenix and Scottsdale and Tucson have more in common with California than any place else. So there was a cultural thing there. Tucson at one time had been part of Mexico. And so there was a lot for me to learn there. I've learned over the years more from my reporters than I have from my bosses. They wouldn't like it hearing me say that, but it's true. And so many of them taught me things just like those 2 did on making assignments and including women. But there were other things I learned here and also there. But I, spent 37 years on the Huntington newspapers and 15 years on the Tucson newspapers.
I wanted to ask you sort of a personal question. I know your wife passed away in September of 2007 after a 10-year battle with
17.
2017, excuse me.
Just a few months ago.
A few months ago, after a 10-year battle with cancer, and I know she was a big part of your life, as not only as your wife, but also in the communities in which you live. Can you tell us a little bit about the impact she had as in your career and as you were working?
Yes, well, she was certainly part of, not just part of my life, part of my career, and that came from the time I first met her, because I was a sports writer then, and she would go with me when we were dating and then when we were first married to cover games. And she would sit in the stands and she would wait until I interviewed the coaches after the game. There was one time I was covering a state championship game in Parkersburg, and she went with me. And so she drove back while I sat with a portable typewriter on my lap writing the story. Now she took the wrong turn and almost drove us into the Ohio River, but we got home okay. But she was always there. And then when I moved up the ladder and became an editor, she knew my entire staff, and they treated her like one of them. They loved her. Now, when we went to Tucson, it was a teaching moment for both of us, because in Huntington, she and I had grown up with the people I was working with, some of whom then were working for me. When I went to Tucson, they saw me, my staff saw me and her, as the publisher and his wife, not as one of us, not as peers. It did not take long for them to understand our roles, and that we didn't consider ourselves up on top of any ladder above them. We made friends there as well. But Sandy was all over the place in Tucson on so many boards, especially at the University of Arizona. She didn't fight one cancer for 10 years. She had 3 cancers during that 10-year span. And she actually passed away this past September because her heart was worn out. It just gave out. It could no longer, being bombarded with various medications and chemo and radiation, finally her heart just could not do it. So she beat cancer 3 times, but then passed away with heart problems.
I wanted to ask you, back to your book for just a second, that there was a section that I really found interesting that where you talk about some of your lessons that you've learned, or kind of your experiences and lessons, and sort of what you've taken away from your career in journalism. And I wanted to ask you about a couple of those and kind of get your thoughts on that, because I just found them really interesting, and I found not only to be interesting about journalism, but I think they're really good sort of little lessons about life. And this comes from chapter 54, which is titled "In Retrospect." So I want to ask you about a couple of these and just get you to comment on those. Never lie to get to the truth.
Right. Not every newspaper person would agree with that. Some people, some reporters, have lied about something, including who they were, to get to the story, to get to the truth. I really believed in that, don't lie to get to the truth. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that we did not always identify ourselves, or we did not sometimes try to go where we weren't invited or weren't allowed. And we uncovered a lot of important stories that way. But I can't recall ever lying or having any of my reporters lie to get to a story. Now, some reporters do. I tell you that the closest we came, and it turned out to be a positive story, we had gotten a tip that there were terrible things going on at the Huntington State Hospital. I decided to put a reporter in there to find out. But I didn't want to call them and say, may I put a reporter in there? Because they would guard everything. So I had a reporter, Doug Imbrogno. He recently has been on the Charleston Gazette. Volunteer at the hospital. And his name was Doug Imbrogno, but when he volunteered, he didn't use the Doug, he used his middle name. And nobody paid any attention. They were delighted to get another volunteer. But he was in there to find out if all the rumors about patients getting beaten and facilities being dirty and so forth. He went there for several days, and he came back to see me, and he said, those rumors are false. He said, that hospital does a tremendous job with its resources. They need more people. Nobody is being beaten. So what we had planned to have as a story on bad things going on turned out to be a story on the good things going on and why they need more resources and the good things they're doing with limited resources. And so that was great. was glad that happened. We didn't lie, but we did tell him he wanted to volunteer. That's as close as I've come to shading the truth.
Very good. Very good. I love that story, too. Another little takeaway that we get in chapter 54, don't promise, or you say, don't promise what you may not be able to deliver.
That's right, and I believe very much in that, and that's not always easy because some bosses, some managers like to promise the world, and if they fall short, well, that's life. But I never wanted to promise what I wasn't sure we could deliver, especially in working with reporters. Reporters are a curious and suspicious and crazy lot. As I say in the book, a friend of mine, a coach, said that if we would charge admission to our newsroom, we'd make a fortune because it was filled full of characters. And I write about some of those people. And it is true. But I learned early on to be totally upfront and honest with everybody who works for you, to be as transparent as you can be. And if you can't tell them something, say, I can't tell you that. I'll tell you when I can, which wasn't very often. But don't tell them something that's wrong. Don't lie to them. And don't promise them that things will be better tomorrow if you don't know that they will.
Very good. A third one I really liked, because I think this, again, ties right into journalism, but also so many other workplace situations in which there's conflict or could be potential conflict. You write, praise in public and criticize in private. Tell us a little bit about that.
Again, something that I've tried to do all along, because no one, in my mind, deserves to be embarrassed. I learned the hard way working for some bosses that didn't feel quite that way. They would get on reporters in the middle of the newsroom and everybody else would watch. Or they would get on them in front of a couple of editors or another reporter in their own offices. And I thought that was a terrible embarrassment and terrible thing to do. So what I tried to do was, when I needed to meet with somebody over something that they'd done and shouldn't have done, or a mistake they had made, or whatever it was, I always did it in the privacy of my office, just the two of us. Or if there was a reason we needed a witness, one other editor.
Very good. And I wish more people, more bosses or supervisors took that under consideration in terms of praising employees and criticizing, because I've certainly been in environments where you've seen people get embarrassed and in some cases humiliated for a mistake that they
Well, I
made.
held monthly staff meetings, and if some of our people, or even one of our reporters, had won an award or had won special praise from somebody, I would save it and share it with the newsroom at that staff meeting, and they would get applause. And it was a nice moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you about your writing process. When did you get the idea to do this book? Because this is your third book. And what was the process like in putting it together?
Well, my two sons, they both passed away 2 months apart, 4 years before Sandy passed away. They were very bright, read all the time, knew all about my newspaper career, and at the dinner table, when they were visiting, when they were there, I would tell stories, and my son Joel said, "Dad, you've just got to write about that. You've got to put this in a book." And I said, "No, there are people out there that have had much greater careers in newspapers than I have. I mean, I never worked for the New York Times. I was not a war correspondent." And he said, "Well, lots of people write about the New York Times and about being a war correspondent, but who's going to write about the stuff that you've been doing, which a couple of things are unique, like how I got the assignment and how I moved the Huntington newsrooms from typewriters and paste pots to computers, especially when I didn't know a thing about computers." And he said, "That's a great story. You need to write about that." So I thought about it, and I started writing. I finished a first draft, and it was painfully honest and personal. And then I felt guilty because I knew that it would, if it ever got published, it would cause pain for some people. And I thought, at this point in my life, why do I want to cause pain for anybody? It's just not worth it. And I put it away, and then I went back to it and read it, and I thought, well, this is not even very well written. This needs a lot of editing. And I'm still uncertain about some of the things I say about some people I've worked for and with. But then I said to myself, well, I want to be honest. Then my two sons passed away, and I lost interest in the book because in my mind I was writing it for them and any grandchildren they might have. So I just put it up. And friends kept saying, you need to go back to that and get that out. It's important. And one person in particular, Kelsey Murphy, the great glass artist, said, well, let me have it. And I gave her the manuscript. She took it home and read it. She came back and she said, yeah, I can see what you're talking about, but it still needs to be published. There's too much good in it and too many things in there that are different that aren't done on other newspapers, I'm sure. And then after that, I said to a friend, anything happens to me, I want you to just destroy this manuscript. I don't want it published. And he said, well, I'm not going to destroy it. And I said, why? I want you to. He said, no, the first thing I'll do is read it, and then I'll decide what to do with it. And I said, well, it might cause some pain to some people. He said, then to take those parts out. And I said, and it's not all that well written. Then he said, rewrite it. I mean, that was probably good advice. So a few days later, I sat down, got out the old manuscript. There it is.
Very good.
So the second time around, I did soften a couple of things I said about a couple of people. But I didn't take a whole lot out. But it did need work.
Okay.
So,
excellent. This may seem like a loaded question as we get close to finishing up here, but as we see the newspaper business changing, and as we see most communities don't have morning and evening papers anymore, some communities are losing their newspapers totally.
right.
We're in this 24-hour Twitter, Facebook way of getting information. As you look at the discipline of journalism or the career of journalism, what do you think about it today?
Well, first of all, you don't get much information off Twitter. You get tons of opinions.
Yeah.
But not much information, and certainly very few facts. Social media in total is not, in some ways, in my mind, to be trusted unless you check out the sources yourself, check out the facts. Some are better than others. Now, a lot of people I know would say, well, that's the same with newspapers. You can't trust newspapers either. The thing about newspapers is you have a gatekeeper. That's an editor or two editors or five editors. There used to be 5 readings of a story before it got in the paper. Unfortunately, even on newspapers, that's no longer true. I fear that too often it's going from the reporter or the writer straight into print without a good editor shaping up the copy. I mean, when I read newspapers today, I cringe at all the bad grammar. But for that matter, you hear it on television as well. But what you said is correct. There are not very many cities, if any, that have 2 newspapers, morning and evening. And of course, in my day, you had both. And homes had both. There are some newspapers now that have gone to 5-day publication or 3-day publication instead of 7-day publication. So as I say in here, the glory days of newspapers are long behind us. Never be what it once was, where if you were a newspaper writer, particularly a columnist, you were a celebrity. It's not true today. Maybe for a few on major newspapers, but I don't think that's true as much. And it's unfortunate. I read 2 newspapers every day online. I don't read them in print. That's the Boston Globe, which I think is one of the best newspapers in America, best sports section in America by far, and the Arizona Daily Star because I lived there. oddly enough, I worked on 2 evening newspapers, and neither one of them exists anymore.
Yeah.
Both have died, as evening newspapers are doing. But I don't see a great future for newspapers. I think if we stop thinking of newspapers as being paper and print, and think of the distribution part of it, and treat online papers as what they are, newspapers, in which the distribution is what's different. It's not on your front porch in paper form, but it's on your computer in digital form. And if we can do that with the same kinds of skills and responsibilities that newspapers once had years ago, then I think it's fine. I don't think we have to have print newspapers. I'd rather read a print newspaper. I read the Herald-Dispatch every day in print. But I don't want to get away from this idea that newspapers still exist. They just exist in a different form.
Yeah, very well said, very well said. And I know, I think about myself growing up, I learned partly how to read from reading newspapers, box scores in the sports page during baseball season, the comics, growing up, and then getting into some of the more hard news. And so I feel the same way. I hope that newspapers will always be a part of our information literacy, even if it is in a different platform.
I would like to say this, if we have time, that we've sort of dwelt on things that sound pretty deep, pretty tragic, pretty sad, but there's a lot of humor in this book too.
Absolutely there is.
And so I wouldn't want people to think, well, there's a book that's going to bring me down.
Right.
Some of it will, and some of it, I hope, will make you smile.
It is. It is a great book, Don. And as we finish up with you today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about your latest book, Newspaperman, a memoir, or the other 2 books that you've written, Don Hatfield Cleans Out His Attic and A Pocket Full of Cinders, or they want to talk to you about writing or your career, first of all, how can they get in contact with you, and then where can they get copies of your book?
Well, copies of the book are here at Empire Books. They're in the Huntington Museum of Art. They're in the lobby of the Herald-Dispatch newspaper. They're in Heritage Station, Red Caboose, and they're on Amazon.com. In fact, about 40 have sold already on Amazon.com. And there may be other outlets that we haven't gotten to yet. For instance, they're considering it now in Tamarack.
Good.
And Taylor Books in Charleston. So we'll have to say don't have that ironed out yet.
Don Hatfield has been our guest here today on Chapters, former publisher and editor of the Huntington, West Virginia Herald-Dispatch and the Tucson, Arizona Citizen, as well as a regional vice president of Gannett Newspapers. We've been talking about his new book, Newspaperman, a Memoir. It's an outstanding book if you want to know what it's like to be a journalist and what it's like to be a part of journalism in different locations and as time moves on. And as Don said, we talked a lot about some of the sadder things, but there is a lot of humor and great stories in here about great writing. So Don, congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming on Chapters to talk about it. And as you keep writing, we'll have you back on more to talk about.
Good.
So,
thank you very much.
thank you. We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and pick up a copy of Don's book, and also remind you that many of the other author, editor, and publishers that you've seen featured on our program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square and get whatever reading taste you have satisfied right here with the selection of works at Empire Books and News, and we appreciate their support and sponsorship each and every program here on Chapters. And one of the ways that we have made it possible for you to stay in touch with the program is through a variety of social media platforms. One of those is email. And our email address is right here at the bottom of the screen, lp4@zoominternet.net. We do read and respond to all the email that we receive, but we do ask that you please write your name and town or community in which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. If you don't like email and you're more of a YouTube viewer, we have a Chapters page through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen. Once you get to that page, just select or tap on the Chapters tab, and we've got all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And if you don't like those two platforms, platforms and you're a Facebook viewer and a Facebook user, we've got a Chapters page on Facebook, and that address is also here at the bottom of the screen. The only difference between the Facebook page and the YouTube page is the Facebook page has more of our recent interviews archived there as well, but you can comment and interact with viewers of the program, share and repost those episodes on your page or other pages that you belong to. So whatever social media platform you like, Facebook, YouTube, email, we've made it possible for you to stay in contact with what's going on here on the program. And we know many of you have done that in one of those formats or another, and we appreciate that very much. So please keep sharing, please keep commenting, and please keep staying in touch with what we're doing here on Chapters. And that will do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.